Hi, and welcome to the Alternative Path podcast. I'm Andrew Bloomstone,
And I'm Teichman.
and we're very excited to welcome our first guest, Julian Wells, Studenthaus.
Thanks for having me.
Julian, let's kick it off. Let's hear a little bit about what Studenthaus is and what you're working on.
Yeah, absolutely. So Studenthaus is basically an organization that works with developers, charities, municipalities, universities, everyone to help them understand what renters want, specifically student renters. Kind of the really broad strokes background of what we do.
It's my understanding you're aggregating demand-side data. How do you do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're really focused on understanding kind of who consumers are. I'm a big believer that in housing and real estate, all the data that's out there is very supply side focused. So it's all about the rental prices, it's all about occupancy rates, who owns what, where, when it was last bought, all of that. And I'm a big believer that that's really relevant data, but understanding the consumer and who people are, who's coming into these units, what's their stories, where are they coming from, that's really important too. So we basically do survey work. We do a lot of research about who these people are, asking them their histories, their stories, how they're living today, how they wish they were living, and really trying to kind of understand what makes a market tick, particularly in the student housing market.
And I mean, as young professionals, I think we're not so far away from that. Is that like an inspiration for founding Studenthaus in the first place?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. Studenthaus has been kind of a work in progress over the course of the last 2 years. It all kind of kicked off when I was a student at UVic. I just recently graduated about like a year and a half ago now. While I was at UVic, it was incredibly challenging for me to find a place to live after I came out of my on-campus residence in first year. I believe it took me 3 to 4 months, almost the entire summer, to find a place. I think I'm from Toronto initially and had moved out to Victoria, and I had signed my lease for Victoria for that fall about 3 days before I was going to move in, which is mind blowing. I hadn't even seen it except for like a Zoom tour. So it took me literally like 3 to 4 months to find it. It ended up being way out of my price range, 30 minutes, 2 buses away from campus. But it kind of alerted me that, okay, housing is this really big problem and how can I somehow be a part of the solution? And to kind of take you down that path, I started UVic Real Estate Club after finishing up my first internship in the space, to kind of address the fact that at UVic there was no way for students that were interested in housing to get involved in the space. There was no education. We didn't have a real estate program. There was no networking capacity, no way for you to learn about real estate or meet real estate professionals unless you were sending them cold emails, which I was, but trying to kind of create that opportunity for other people. So we started UVic Real Estate Club, and it ended up working really, really tremendously. But what I think became one of the most impactful parts of that was this third core focus besides education and networking. It was advocacy. We saw this opportunity where a lot of city council meetings, like development and housing in general, is such a complex topic, and getting housing approved is so challenging in the best of times. But when it's in a more polarized city or a more challenging market, it can be really hard to get developments through. So we saw that in public hearings, there was kind of an overwhelming voice of these kind of more privileged homeowners, NIMBYs, as you might call them. And there wasn't a lot of perspective being heard from young people like us. There wasn't a lot of students or recent grads in the room. Now, I'm a little bit biased to believe that that's because when you put a public hearing at 7 p.m. on Thursday night, there aren't going to be a lot of young people or young parents that show up to support that. So what we kind of did as the Real Estate Club is we saw an opportunity to bring that perspective of like passionate young people into the conversation and bring students into public hearings, and talk a little bit about the challenges that we were facing as students. I was able to share my story about spending months and months trying to find a place. I remember one really tangible one that we shared was we had a student friend who was renting a backyard to pitch a tent in, and then using they were sharing the washroom and kitchen inside the front, but they were renting a backyard to pitch a tent.
Crazy.
It's insane. So that was kind of the beginning stages where we saw that there was this real housing crisis that young people were facing, and we needed to give them a space to kind of share that perspective. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the decision makers, city councilors, city staff, even the developers that were trying to propose housing in the city, like they really value this perspective, and that kind of gave me a bit of a light bulb, or like a light bulb went off in my head. I said, what if this issue doesn't just happen in Victoria? What if young people have perspectives that need to be shared all across the country? So that led into something called the Student Housing Initiative, which was kind of like an organization that I spun off in my third year of university, where we tried to replicate this idea of students sharing their perspectives at city council, but without actually having to take 20-year-olds to city council meetings on like a Thursday night, which, as you can imagine, not a lot of people would enjoy. But yeah, just back to the story. Student Housing Initiative, it went really well. We surveyed students nationally in 2023 in Vancouver, Victoria, and Toronto, and then did the same thing in 2024, adding Kelowna and Calgary into the mix. And throughout that process, we were able to give $8,000 back to students in the way of tuition grants, I think of $500 each to 16 students. And we were also able to, leverage that data that we collected in about 5,000 units of housing approvals in Vancouver and Victoria, which was really cool. Like, it was for me at that stage, it was like an opportunity to prioritize kind of impact over trying to like start a business. But how did we get to where I am today, like starting Studenthaus, where we now work with some of the biggest developers in the country who are trying to build student housing? I graduated from university, and it became kind of an opportunity where I was like, I want to keep building this. I want to keep doing something on my own. And Studenthaus was, for me, it felt like the next evolution of the Student Housing Initiative, where we could do this all across the country and work on really large-scale student housing projects. As a Student Housing Initiative, we were doing this on all kinds of development, not just student housing. We would lend our perspective and our data to multifamily, rental, like anything that we could see a tangible benefit for young people in the city, and that was really the thesis. As Studenthaus, we found that our connection to campus is most helpful and relevant to student housing projects. So yeah, that's really the broad, deep story of how we kind of started Studenthaus, and that's how I got here today.
Incredible, like the tie in being a student, giving back to the students, making that all come together. It's nice as young people to hear that, especially.
I appreciate it.
I'm going to quickly get into accolades.
Yeah.
BC 30 under 30.
Thank you.
Fantastic accomplishment. But what's next? Is there something else you're trying to pursue, or next milestone?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think not really at the time, not really right now. I think my sole focus right now is how can I deliver the most value to the housing ecosystem in Canada. I think when I was so fortunate to get 30 under 30 at BC Businesses magazine, and it definitely like drove a bit of imposter syndrome, but I also think, being a little bit candid, it gave me a bit of an ego, which I don't think I leverage externally very frequently, but internally it kind of gave me this perspective where I feel like I can do things. Like there was a lot of imposter syndrome that came with that, but it also helped me realize that, okay, maybe I'm onto something here. Maybe I shouldn't just go jump at an entry-level role somewhere and go try to work up a corporate ladder. Maybe I should go try to follow this and see if there's a little bit more runway to take this down. And I think that was a great decision. Mm-hmm. So I like accolades, I think, are kind of secondary to an opportunity for impact. Something that I'm really excited about, our data was used in a House of Commons speech in about a bill that was put forward by a private member, member of Parliament, Braden Clark in Nova Scotia, talking about the need for a housing strategy specifically for young Canadians, which I'd be really excited to see move forward. I think like no matter what part of the political spectrum you stand on, I think young people in Canada are facing a lot of challenges right now, and I think we need to have more focus from our government on young people. I think that's a really big issue that we should be more aligned on as a whole. So I'd love to see that move forward, and that was just a really cool experience for me, kind of full circle.
Unspoken, it benefits us all having housing for not only students but young adults in the city. And living in Toronto, I really feel I live near student areas, and I definitely feel like this would be nice if everyone could, make the neighborhood feel alive. Let the students like have a little bit of breathing room with their rents, and that's really impactful to hear this.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I really think that like it's just very much the thesis of student housing. Like if you build housing for students and young Canadians, you're taking pressure off the broader rental market. Like that's really the case for student housing at a policy level and at a city level, is if you focus on creating housing for this specific demographic of young people who are kind of facing a bit of an unfair market, where they're kind of the really one of the more partially impacted groups in the housing crisis right now. If you build housing for young people, create so much space for other people in the market, and it's really a two birds with one stone opportunity, in my opinion.
You touched on this a little earlier, but I feel like it's a great question to ask you. You include students in your process. So what's your process all about? What does it entail?
Yeah, absolutely. So the data that we collect is kind of, we've found the strategy of going direct to students, which I think has worked really well. I think students are a really challenging demographic to get perspective from in a lot of other settings. Maybe that's why city council is hosting public hearings at 7 p.m. on a Thursday night that don't have a lot of young engagement involved. But for us, that's kind of where this idea of kind of going direct to students, going around on campuses, trying to talk to as many people as possible. We have digital surveys. So I actually did this fall. We just wrapped up a national student housing survey at 25 campuses across the country, and we ended up getting about 6,000 students to respond, which was really cool. But so to back up with that survey, we hired about 20 to 25 interns, almost one at each campus, who would go around at the campus and ask students to scan a QR code and fill out a short survey. And we would give a chance to win a $100 Visa gift card for their time. And then I personally spent the fall going to all of these 20 campuses as well, trying to help our interns, which we found to be really effective. So kind of taking that like random sample of going up to as many different students in as many different parts of the campus as possible, at different times of the day, at different days, really trying to get like that diverse representation of what kind of students and what kind of housing experience a broad group of students at this campus is.
Would you be, I know the market outlook for 2025 is not kind of yet, but give us a teaser, give us any information or some insight into what you've noticed?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a couple kind of highlights. One that really excites me and I think is really interesting. So we asked students about their perception of affordability. Like, do you feel that your housing is affordable in your current circumstance? And in past years, well, granted, we had much less participation. Like, we were nowhere near scale of the operation that we had this year. In the past, I think it was 50%, give or take, like 50-50 on affordability, maybe even below 50 found their rent affordable. This year, we had 62% of students say that, like nationally, say that their rent was affordable for their term if they weren't living at a family home. So people who were paying rent, which is really interesting. And I think one of the things that I find really fascinating about this idea of affordability is the role that family support plays in that. So we asked about whether or not your parents or family members help you pay your rent. So we had about, I think, 66% receive family support. 66% of students that weren't already living at home. So to break that down, right, we would have 100% of the market, and I believe 30%, give or take, nationally are living with family members or in a family home. I don't have that 30% in front of me, so I'll have to double check it. But if you assume that those 30%, we count that as family support, we just kind of ignore them. They're living at home at some form of family support, right? The rest of that market, the rest of the country, of that remaining 70%, 66% have parents paying for some portion of their rent. And we went even further. We asked what percentage of your rent are your parents paying? And again, kind of breaking into further segments, we had 70% of the people who were receiving family support had their entire rent paid for by family, which is really fascinating because if you think about this idea of affordability where, if the money is not coming out of your bank account at the end of the month, do you really feel the pain of having to pay X dollars per month in rent? Like, is that something that's really impacting you if you're not the one paying it? Can you really feel this idea of affordability if you're not having to decide whether or not you can afford this? So that's something that I think we want to look into further, and that's going to be one of the things that we look at is that correlation between affordability and family support. So that's one really cool one, is that this idea of affordability. The second that I think is really interesting is a focus on amenities. We see a lot of a focus on amenities in a lot of housing development, but specifically student housing. And I think broadly there's a case for it. I think like in a market where there's not a lot of student housing, specifically off campus, you can argue that there will be a portion of the market that really wants amenities, they want this really high-end product, and that can justify high rents. And I think that market exists in almost every tier 1 university market in Canada, for sure. But that market is limited, in my opinion. I think that there's a big market in Canada, and our data, our questions kind of indicated this to me. There's this big market that would rather save money on rent and have less amenities. So let's say you're building a student housing building and you could pack more units in and therefore lower the rent because you're offering more units. And you can pack more units in instead of putting in like a games room or like golf simulators or something like really crazy. If you can do that and lower the rents, you should. And that was one of the data points that we found is so we asked about two things. We asked about a gym and we asked about a games room. We asked with a gym, would you rather pay an extra $50 per month in rent and have a gym, or save those $50 and not have a gym in your accommodation? Nationally, we had 42% of people say they would rather pay that $50 per month extra in rent, which I think is interesting because a lot of campuses offer like discounted or free gym memberships. And 42%, like that's a non-insignificant number. But games room, so this was the second one we asked. And games room I kind of see as a bit of a placeholder for a lot of these like lower utility rooms that maybe it's not helping a student save money elsewhere. 15% nationally said if we asked them, would you rather save $50 every month or pay an extra $50 and have a games room in your apartment, in your building? 15% said they would like that games room.
Really?
Which again to me is so indicative. It's like if you can save money or if you can pull back the rents by replacing some amenity space with more units, really interesting to me.
That is interesting.
While there's the case for the high-end market for sure, I think in every campus or every university market, it's to a point.
Yeah. It's like the Ryanair approach where they remove washrooms or make standing room just so they can lower the price of tickets.
Yeah, except in this case, it's like removing kind of the screens off the back of the television, and if you can like remove the screens off the back of the television and like add in more rows of seats or something, right? Like make it cheaper for everybody. It's really interesting. I think broadly in student housing in Canada, there's just massive opportunity in middle market kind of housing for the middle class. It's literally just high quality, no frills housing.
Yeah.
That's like just housing.
Yeah.
And I think there are some firms that are tackling it well in Canada. But we need so much more of it that's a really big area of opportunity in student housing in my opinion.
So interesting. Is there any like unstructured data or people giving their own opinion in the survey? And if so, is there anything in there that really stood out to you?
Yeah, so we focus mostly on like multiple choice questions here. So there isn't a ton of unstructured data, but what I can tell you is, again, I had the opportunity, either fortunately or unfortunately, if you think about it, to go to these 25 campuses throughout the fall and spoke to probably 3,000-4,000 students. I think my social battery was a little bit drained. But I think a lot of the sentiment there was really kind of enlightening as to what students in that area were going through. Like I would constantly hear students like tell their friends like, "Oh, you need this. Like you can't find home. It's basically homeless," and it's crazy like how normalized that is, right? Like what I was saying earlier about in Victoria, we had this friend who was renting a backyard to pitch a tent. If that's normalized in Victoria, like how many otody markets is that?
I can't believe doing that all winter. Like that's insane.
Okay, if Victoria doesn't get that cold, it's still. But I can't even begin to justify it, right? Like it's really concerning. And I think that's been the thesis across the country is like, well, yes, the macroeconomic landscape and housing as a whole, we know that things have kind of looked a little bit better in the last 6 months to 12 months, whether it's due to a large deliberative supply or kind of the change in international students. There's been, I think, kind of multiple things that have kind of hit at the right time and created a positive effect on rents going down in the market and creating a little bit of more of a renter's market for people people at universities. But I don't think that's going to last forever. I think there's opportunities that may shift.
I totally agree. Well, looking at the data, all the deliveries are for the next 2 years.
Exactly.
Those get absorbed.
Yeah.
Pricing is going to go right back up.
Totally.
Fundamentally, something has to change to keep that affordability for the long term.
Yeah. Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think it's exactly in my opinion why we just have to be looking ahead to the future and trying to create ways in challenging economic conditions to deliver and to continue to start building. Because when you start building, it's still going to be a couple. You start to look to deliver, it's still going to be a couple years down the road, especially in more challenging markets. Yeah, completely agree.
So what has to change? If you don't mind me asking.
Yeah, of course. I think policy is a big one. Like to speak again, like more candidly, I think the budget that came out recently in fall 2025 was interesting, and I think housing wise there were some good commitments there. But when I look at young people, I think we're missing the mark. I think there's a really big opportunity to kind of be leaders in Canada, like broadly Canada compared to the US, UK, Australia. We're so far behind in student housing provision. I think Canada's at like 15%, and these other markets are 30, 35%, right? So it's like, for me, we have to look at policies that can get us closer to that. And we don't have universities that are able to deliver themselves, with kind of the exception of UBC, who I think do a really good job. So I think figuring out ways to invest in young people via housing is something that we should be focusing on. Now, I think one of the challenges in creating policy for student housing is that there's no real definition of what off-campus student housing is. You know what your on-campus student housing is. It's within campus limits. It's like dorm rooms or apartments. Only like registered students live there, like first year primarily. But off-campus, it's kind of, what is this? Like, it's a new concept to a lot of Canadian cities and municipalities, really. So it's hard to zone, it's hard to finance, it's hard to create policy for all of this. So I think that's one of really the first levers that needs to change, and that's something that we're hopefully gonna do as a result of this data that we've collected, is kind of try to put a thesis forward of what this actually could be.
So I think obviously your data is going to be incredibly useful for developers or just the general public. How does that system work? Are they coming to you to access the data?
Yeah, I've been really fortunate that we've had over the last kind of 18 months, 12 to 18 months, I've had a really kind of focused pipeline working with a lot of student housing builders. I'm excited in kind of the next 6 months to open that up a little bit more. I think one group that I haven't worked with a lot is universities, because they're a little bit more archaic and slow. But if a university is going to spend 5 figures on like a housing study, and I have data that complements that, and I'm going to do it every year, I feel like there's no reason we shouldn't be tied in to some extent. So that's one group that I'm really excited to kind of push for and go after a little bit more. I think continuing to work with private developers continues to be a goal of mine. Municipalities, planning organizations. Like my biggest goal is, we've just done this massive national study. We've gotten 6,000 responses from students, really well spread out, with about an average, I'd say, of 300, 350 students per market in really all of the biggest student housing markets in the country, which I believe puts us really in the driver's seat of understanding what students want and who students are, where they're currently living, what their background is, kind of segmenting that market, if you will. So that's really what we're trying to get in front of people, right? Like I was talking about, this like higher end amenitized product. I think there's space for it in the market, but to a point. And how do you figure out when you're at that point? Well, maybe if you can get kind of a peek under the hood at what makes up a housing market, what makes up like a student population, what percent are international students, what percentage are people who have a little bit more money to pay, what percent, really trying to understand that like segmented approach of who renters are, because I think there's just no data about who renters are other than like the census. Like the census is every 4 or 5 years, right? So it's really inconsistent.
Definitely feeling a serious market gap. Have you noticed that when you're speaking with like clients, people who are interested in your data?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really one thing that has been really helpful for me, kind of kickstarting this company and seeing it as a more of being like pulled into this space. Actually, when I graduated, we tried like a bunch of different ideas, like what am I going to do? Like I knew I wanted to start something. I knew I wanted to continue what I was doing. But I tried building like a roommate matching software, like a kind of Tinder for roommates, if you will. Housing marketplace for students, I think, was classic.
Yeah.
You see an issue and you want to like go out and directly solve it, but it's so hard to build. So we tried all these different things, and eventually I just got pulled right back into what we were doing before, which was these like large scale surveys about how students thought at different campuses. And the reason for that was just the interest, right? Like people wanted to hear what we had to say, and I think we've continued to kind of drum up more and more traction every year. And I'm really excited for this specific release of data. I think there's like a very clear story to tell here, and I can see how it like fits into some of the work that we've done across the country.
From a developer lens, could you provide us with any data that they might find helpful or encouraging?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we did is we looked at kind of how much students are willing to pay to live closer to campus. Like, is proximity something that really matters to students? And if yes, are they willing to pay more to live closer? If no, or just in general, like how far away from campus would students like to live? So one thing we asked is, would you rather pay $250 more per month in rent to live 5 minutes from campus, or pay $250 less and live 45 minutes from campus? I think 65% said they would rather pay more and be closer. Now again, that's kind of an indicated and like a self-indication of what you're willing to do. It's less of a like in an ideal world, we would be able to go 0 to 1, and we could take this understanding of the consumer and see actually how they behave in the market with like verifiable proof. Which is it's a challenging concept, and I'd love to see that kind of transparency somehow in the market. So that's one piece, is like I think proximity does really matter for students. But one thing else that was really notable is that when you look at a market in general, we get a lot of questions from people who are looking to build or buy student housing. It's like, how far away from campus is still interesting, at least in big cities specifically, where there's a lot of transit. So one thing we asked is like, how far would you be willing to commute via transit to get to campus? And it was really interesting. We asked like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, all the way up to 30 minutes or more. And there was like a kind of the concentration of the distribution was right around 15 minutes. So the vast majority, and of course, the classic 15 minutes city theory, but it was really interesting to see that kind of come into fruition, where like 30% wanted to be right at that 15 minutes, and then it kind of tailed off where it was like 20% at 10 minutes, 10% at 5 minutes, and kind of the exact way in the other direction. Where I think still 10% would be willing to live 30 minutes away. But again, I think it's all about that trade-off of like the right price, and how do you deliver that in like challenging market conditions is an important question.
Like give you context, we work in brokerage and do a lot of student housing. But that's obviously a question we ask ourselves all the time. Like, what's the ideal distance? When can we cut off at the 1 kilometer mark, at the 10-minute walking distance, where we're talking to land that's 20 minutes outside of the campus, and we're trying to figure out if that's desirable. Incredibly helpful data.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like that's where I get really excited, is we can one of like some of the questions we've asked is like, that's obviously like the national level. We have market-based data, we have university-based data, and then we could theoretically go further to kind of create these personas or subgroups of students, and then we could look at that specific subgroup of students and say, how far are they willing to go? So if you say you understand that you're building this project that's maybe for the higher end consumer, you can understand, what does the higher end consumer want? What does that persona want? What's their willingness to commute? What's their willingness to pay for amenities? All of these different things. Because then you can actually tailor your product to the people that you think are actually living there, which is exciting for me.
That's really exciting. It's like a new development to be able to say, like, we have data that supports putting in an amenity because we're 15 minutes or 20 minutes from campus, versus maybe we shed the amenities because we're 5 minutes from campus.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And I think that's one of the interesting things too that we've seen with data, and like going back to this like student housing initiative, all those like 2-3 years ago, seeing the value that data can play in the approvals process, when you can specifically point to something that says people want this. They might not be like the vocal majority out here who are like holding their pitchforks, but they're tangible and they want this, and there is a need in the market for this, and being able to point that to lenders, investors, municipalities, is crucial. So that's been really cool to be a part of.
Year over year, have you seen any trends? I know this is not the first survey you've done.
No, it's not, and like I said, I haven't super gotten around to taking that year over year look really in depth. But some things that I think have stayed constant is this desire for connectivity. a willingness to pay for proximity. Grocery store is something that everyone wants in all the neighborhoods, right? It's like we asked about kind of what's a crucial kind of focal anchor of a new development or like developing community, and it's a grocery store. Like by far and away the most heavily favored or highest ranked like community amenity, and that's been so consistent year after year. So I think it's that like 15-minute city theory, like everyone wants to be within walking distance. We ask about incentives to get rid of cars or stop driving or stop using cars, and it's again, it's transit connectivity. Having a world-class transit system is like, if there's an investment in transit from the city or there's transit like right outside the development, people have much less of a need for housing, or sorry, much less of a need for cars. I know when I was in university, I never had a car. I just took the bus everywhere. It was great. So I think those are some of the really consistent year-over-year similarities. Some of the things that have shifted, I think, is this desire to desire to live with people like others is always really interesting. Because I think broadly, some people make this mistake. I think where you think of students as like a monolith, or like they have the same set of opinions. But in reality, there's a certain percent of students that want to live on their own. There's a certain percent of students that want to live with like 4+ friends, right? Like, and then there's some people in the middle, right? So it's really challenging to like benchmark a market of students and like say, oh, students want this. No, it's like some students want this, some students want this, and it's like, how do you deliver a product that meets the needs of your target market is really, I think, the question that we answer.
I'm always curious because you're talking about the student living styles. How does co-living kind of play into this? Are you seeing that in your data at all?
Co-living is really interesting. I was actually in Vancouver on a panel, or a roundtable about co-living with CMHC and a co-living startup called Toboggan Flats in mid-November, which was really cool. And I think it's co-living is very interesting. I think there are students that will be interested in it for sure, and I think we should absolutely be looking at creative out-of-the-box ideas and ways to deliver units to market and give people kind of a more affordable place to live. But for me with co-living, one of the things that's really important is you have to have those places for connectivity within the space, like how the amenities in the building are delivered, or how like the common spaces are delivered, how kitchens are used, how many people are sharing a bathroom. It all has to be so intentional, and it has to function as intended, because that's kind of table stakes. Like that's why people are moving there. They're moving there maybe for a reduced rent, sure, but also because they want connection, like they want community. And that's really interesting. Like I think there's this idea of community and programming. I think that's one of the really interesting takeaways from our survey as well, is community, I think, is a very big challenge for a lot of students. And like loneliness is a very real thing post-pandemic. Everyone wants to be together. Everyone wants to be in rooms, gathering and getting to know others and getting to know like-minded people. But we saw that like programming and event rooms and spaces that were kind of less functional were less desired, which was really interesting. So I think it was kind of a signal for me that some people maybe are looking to housing as just housing. And again, it's just really pulls back to that reminder that like, students are not a monolith. Like they're such a well-rounded group that have different perspectives. It's a crazy kind of segmented market. It's really interesting to see.
I'm excited to read the data.
Yes, I'm excited to share some of the takeaways.
Do you want to say when the data is being released?
Yeah, the data. So I think our plan right now is to release some of the national takeaways. We have a couple of people who have been interested in writing reports about it. So planning to do that kind of in mid to late January in 2025. So coming up soon, 2026. Sorry, crazy. I can't believe we're already into the new year. Really looking forward to that. But it should be a cool opportunity. Like I said, one of the other things we want to do with this data is kind of create a bit of a thesis of what is student housing. So that may end up being one of the kind of pillars of that release. We'll see. I'm really looking forward to it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for being on the first episode.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah,
This has been amazing.